I have a confession to make. In doing my research for this lesson to teach you the difference between stative and dynamic verbs, I reached a little bit of an obstacle. You see, up until now, we have been teaching you grammar in the prescriptive fashion. We've been like the doctors, telling you exactly what to do, writing down the rules, handing you your slips, your prescriptions, and saying, do this, and you're going to be okay. And the truth is, there's a different way. And this week, I have learned something about this different way. The other way, the way that is not prescriptive, is actually called descriptive. There's descriptive grammar, and descriptivists, people who believe entirely in the descriptive approach, they look out at the world and they see the way that things are being used on TV and in commercials and with people when they're talking to one another, and they listen and then they change the rules of grammar according to what they find. And all this time I thought I have been a very strict prescriptivist. I've been the doctor. But today I found a descriptive streak, and, well, I'm going to get to telling you why in just a moment. Obviously, in terms of the prescriptions that we've already given you, I stand by those entirely. We have told you that verbs can already be divided into different groups. We can have action verbs and what we've been calling being verbs, right? Verbs that either show action. Sometimes the action is very small and quiet, but it's a choice. It's something that is done. Whereas being verbs, nothing is being done. There's no choice involved per se. What these being verbs do is they describe the noun in some way, or they name or identify the noun, the subject in some way. And then we have regular and irregular verbs, and as you know, this is very prescriptive, right? You look at the simple past tense of the verb, and it will tell you if the verb is regular, if it ends in ed, or if it's irregular, if it doesn't end in ed. That's prescriptive. That's just writing you a script. And then there's transitive and intransitive verbs. You know that intransitive verbs cannot break through the verb wall and reach to the other side and have a direct object. It's impossible. Whereas transitive verbs have to. They must have something to hold on to on the other side of that verb barrier. And that's right in the name. It's prescriptive. But now, we're going to be looking at dynamic and stative verbs. And in the examples and the things I'm going to show you, I'm going to try and explain to you why I have become more descriptive. So let's look at some examples and let's get to the meat of this. Just a reminder that if you need a refresher on any of those verb pairings, whether they're action or being verbs or transitive or intransitive, what was the other one? Regular, irregular, then you can find those in our video library either by clicking on some of them over here or by clicking on our title here, and you have access to all of the videos we've made before. Moving on to continue talking about these stative versus dynamic verbs, we are going to start by giving you the prescriptivist lesson, as is our norm. We're going to write you the doctor's note first and tell you, do this. And then I will hopefully get to some examples as to why I've become more descriptive in this area. But the prescription for stative verbs is as follows. And first, I should probably just remind you that stative is actually an adjective, and what we're really talking about are states of being. So we've already gone through a lot of these in our being versus action or being versus doing verb video. Again, find the link. But as far as stative verbs go, these are the rules. Rule number 1, you cannot use stative verbs as imperatives. Sounds simple enough, right? I mean, that would solve a lot of problems. If I could just say, love me, then my students wouldn't always ask me, teacher, are you married? And then I wouldn't break down and cry in class. Because I could just go up to somebody and say, love me. Oh my goodness, I'm never going to hear the end of that. But let's just move on. Just know that you can't command states of being in other people. That's why you can't do the imperative thing. We can talk about other examples later. Also, you can't use stative verbs in progressive tenses, okay? So, luckily, that takes away pretty much half of the tenses in the English language. No progressive tenses and no perfect progressive tenses. How much easier would that make your writing? Only 6 now to choose from, the simple and the perfect. Also, related to the first one, but maybe this is easier for you to think about, you can't force people to do something, okay? So you can't force stative verbs on another. You can't say, I force you to know the answer. As much as a teacher I would sometimes like to do that, it's just impossible. I can't force a student to know something. It's your responsibility to learn and practice and study until you understand. I hope you're understanding this. Did you get that? Did you hear what I just did there? We'll come back to it in a moment. Now let's look at some examples of what you can do, or what most stative verbs will look like. So first, feelings and emotions. Verbs like love and hate and like and dislike and prefer, these are all stative verbs. And the prescriptivist would say, you can do this. You can say, I love it. But the descriptivist would watch TV, listen to the radio, read signs, or hear people say, I'm loving it. That's all the time. I mean, especially if you frequent some billion-dollar restaurants, if we can even call them restaurants. And I'm not saying you can't disagree, especially grammatically, with big corporations, or in any other way, but everybody kind of is using phrases like, oh, I'm really liking the way that you're wearing that hat, or, you know, I am hating this lesson right now because it's just so confusing and I'm not understanding any of it. Did you catch it? Did you catch it again? We'll get to it. But just know that technically, none of that should be allowed. Even though, for most of us, it probably makes sense because of how we have learned that from within the culture. And that is essentially a more descriptivist stance. Moving on, the prescriptivist at the restaurant would say, oh, I will have a salad. Makes perfect sense. These are ownership. Okay, I'm skipping senses because, as mentioned, we already did that video. So the sense verbs like hear, taste, see, those are all things that you can find in our being type verbs versus action or active type verbs in the videos. I think that's a 3rd grade lesson where we started talking about this stuff. But when we talk about ownership, things like have or own, belong, want, should not be able to use the progressive tense. But I can't tell you how many times I have gone to a restaurant and said, I'm having a salad. I don't have a problem with this. Maybe it's how I grew up, maybe it's where I grew up, maybe it's the world informing me of new language lessons. And part of me has to admit that language rules change over time, and that's a very descriptivist approach. And I never thought I'd say that. I thought I was a pretty strict prescriptivist in my grammar lessons. And for the most part I am, because I'm telling you what to do. Thoughts. Things that we think about, so wishing, thinking, imagining, none of those words should even be allowed, except maybe as gerunds, but that's an entirely different topic. I shouldn't be able to say, I'm hoping things change. What I should say, the prescriptivist would say, I hope things change. And I shouldn't be actively hoping for an extended period of time because I shouldn't be allowed. But the point is this. In language, what happens in terms of changes, or my opinion of what is happening, is that a lot of the strictly stative verbs have been pushed over into the dynamic category. What you have to remember is that a stative verb is actually a state of being. And what a lot of the language is doing, it's saying that we have choice, or we have action, we have the ability to change these things, make choices, and do things where hoping is something that we do, not just something that we are. And, well, I leave it up to you. If you want to follow the prescriptivist account, and there are plenty of examples where you should not say, I'm having 4 people in my family. You should say, I have 4 people in my family. There are times where the prescription makes far more sense and will help you be understood much better. But don't necessarily just take rules as unchangeable, especially when you are within the culture and you are hearing things and you are understanding things, because understand is one of these verbs, and you should not be understanding ever. But did you understand? I hope so. Let's review.
Intro to Stative and Dynamic Verbs. What does prescriptive grammar mean? It means that there is a set of rules for how people think grammar should be used. There is a right and wrong way to use language. What does descriptive grammar mean? It means that the rules for grammar can change based on how language is actually used. There is no clear right or wrong way to use language. What is the difference between action and being verbs? Action verbs show what a noun is doing. Being verbs describe a noun in some way. What is the difference between regular and irregular verbs? Regular verbs end in ed or ied in the simple past tense. Irregular verbs do not. What is the difference between transitive and intransitive verbs? Transitive verbs have to have an object noun after it to complete a thought. Intransitive verbs do not have an object noun after it. What is a stative verb? Stative verbs show a state of being instead of an action. How are stative verbs not used? They cannot be used as imperatives, commands. They cannot be used in the progressive tenses. You cannot force people to do something. How do we use stative verbs? We can use them to show feelings or emotions, senses, ownership, and thoughts. What are some common ownership words? Some common ownership words are own, belong, want, have. What are some common thought words? Some common thought words are wish, think, imagine, hope.